Hello, everyone, and welcome to London 2050. We are delighted to have you here. My name is Kenneth Damien. I'm the chair of the LSE Alumni Association London. It's my privilege to invite you all to this wonderful event, series of panel events, on behalf of both myself and the London 2050 team. Just before we get into the main event, I just wanted to add a few points of housekeeping. First of all, there'll be regular breaks throughout the event, and during that time, the comment section will be live, so definitely use that to engage with the other attendees. In addition, you can use the comment section via the various channels to engage with questions for the panel and any comments you might have in terms of the discussion. In terms of the event today, we're very excited to bring together a host of different speakers from various sectors and channels. They'll be speaking on various aspects of urban change, the arts, real estate, and technology. But really what this event is about is hosting thought leadership around the City of London and millions who call it home or some version of that. We're delighted to have you here with us today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first panel. And first of all, to Martine, who is going to introduce the panel. Martine is a member of the organizing committee for panel number one. And over to you, Martine.
Ken. Hi, thanks, Ken, for that. So this first webinar came together as a combination of sort of personal, academic, and professional connections, trying to bring together people from different sectors of the public sphere, the private sphere, and the civic sphere, and trying to explore kind of what's going on the ground in the City of London, competing interests between the public sphere, the private sphere, and the civic sphere, and how everyone's sort of trying to carve out a space for themselves and assert themselves within the development of London. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kath, our chair.
Thanks very much, Martin. It's a real pleasure to join you all here in London. Maybe some of you are just around the corner from me in South London, and I know that we have viewers who are all over the world. We're going to be talking about London today, but a lot of our lessons will have much wider implications for cities everywhere. My name's Kath Scanlon, and I'm at LSE London, which is a research unit at the London School of Economics, and we specialize in research into urban change and housing. We have 4 panelists with us today, and I'd like to ask them to join me on the virtual stage, please, and to briefly introduce themselves. Could we bring in Neil, Chris, Alex, and Kieran, please? Welcome. So I'll ask you to just say a few words about who you are, and then we'll open up the discussion. Chris, could I start with you, please?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Paddock. I am Director of Place and Economy at a company called PRD. We are a place-focused economy and development consultancy, working mainly in London, but we work across the UK and overseas a little bit as well. We work on economic visions. We support the public sector in developing economic strategy and economic policy around policy and real estate. We also support the civil society sector in terms of building community capacity to engage with that. And we also work at times with developers to help them better engage with the communities in which they live. At the moment, we're supporting London Borough of Newham and significant restructuring around how they think about economy in place. We're also supporting the GLA in their measurement strategy for social integration. And we have a number of ongoing commissions around asset strategy and community involvement in buildings and real estate for a number of boroughs in London as well.
Great, thanks, Chris. Neil, over to you.
Hi there. Good morning, everyone. My name is Neil McDonald, and I'm an artist. I'm an activist, founder of a number of civic non-profit organisations all working in a cross-sector capacity towards ongoing systems change. We did it by creating common resources for communities from a local also into international level, developing sustainable business models, ecosystems, reenacting the commons, creating physical and virtual space for culture to be shared and creativity to inspire people. My focus is facilitating these change ideas and empowering communities to be informed, active citizens, supporting innovative business models where the arts and culture focus on that. So in the past 10 years, I've been running an organization called Sour Space, which I guess is an ecosystem of activities from creative workspace, affordable workspace, an art gallery, to a campaign event space, and lots of other things in there. It's about kind of creating a number of non-profit systems which can exchange value in really tangible ways, whereas you can necessarily do that with normal business structures. So at the moment, I'm working on a number of different organizations this is in the manufacturing industry, from eco buildings to robotics, as well as then creating additional workspace in meanwhile spaces to make sure that people in this locality, especially in recovery from COVID, have access to affordable workspace and be empowered to carry on their work and how their work influences the rest of the community.
Thanks. Kieran, can you tell us about yourself?
Hi, I'm Kieran. I'm a community organizer from Hackney. I grew up in Hackney, and I work as a paid organizer for the Hackney branch of London Renters Union. And London Renters Union is a renters union in London, as the name suggests. And our theory of change, our values are about building power for renters in London, where we see a massive power imbalance, systemic between landlords and tenants, and also like trying to engage with communities in London who are at the sharpest end of the housing crisis, as we often say, where we're seeing ridiculously unregulated rents and development all over the city with displacement everywhere. So our goal is to transform the housing system essentially and build power for renters in London. I'm also part of a few campaigns in London that are focusing on how markets are being affected by development in London. That's the Save Ridley Road campaign in where I grew up in Dalston, and Save Latin Village campaign, which has been a campaign that's been active for about 16 years. Or that struggle in general, that movement in Tottenham has been going for about 16 years. I've been part of that for about 4 years. Yeah.
Thanks, Kieran. And Alex.
Hi, thanks, Kath. I'm Alex Russell. I'm currently Executive Chair of the Hackney Wick and Fish Island Community Development Trust. I've worked in development trust movement for the last 6 or so years. I'm former Chief Executive of one of the largest development trusts in the country, Westway Trust in Kensington, which owns and manages 23 acres of land and 130 small, medium-sized businesses and community group spaces. I am an advisor to Locality, who are the umbrella organisation for community development trusts in the UK, and I work with them to support new and emerging trusts become developed and up and running and sustainable. And I'm a consultant, a private consultant who works with urban development, whether it's with local authorities, developers, and other parties, to look at ways in which social value can be retained within communities, and communities can benefit from development that happens in their area. I'm a former councillor, Labour councillor in Hackney. Got a lot of Hackney representative here today, and have witnessed and been at the sharp end of the benefits of development and the challenges of development for the residents living in areas where it's happening.
Well, let's start with that then. So to open up the discussion, Alex, can you tell us something about what's been happening in urban regeneration recently and what you think the effects are or could be for local residents?
Yeah, sure. I mean, urban development is principally driven by the demand to build more houses because we have a growing population and more people wanting and needing to be living in cities where jobs are. And that demand has meant that land values in London have, particularly in London and in other urban areas, have obviously gone up a huge amount, which creates a whole raft of challenges for local residents, partly because it means that rents will nearly always go up as a result of that, and the price of housing becomes more and more expensive, which means people feel and are not able to live and work in the places where they may have done in generations before them. So we creating that sort of environment, which is really well documented. I don't think anybody's would argue with that. In my experience in London, particularly, what we're seeing is a bit of a hollowing out of places, particularly in sort of the more inner areas of London. As people get pushed out further and further and further, you're having a greater divide between rich and poor. And I think I really recognised that when I was in Kensington working at Westway Trust. The difference between the very wealthiest and the very poorest, and the very and having very few people in between that, caused a huge amount of resentment and disenfranchisement and marginalisation, which presents problems for the public sector, presents problems for the communities that are trying to comprehend that and work a way through that. What would I also say? I would also say that the other thing that I've observed in my period in this area is that the housing is definitely the main driver, and what that means is the local economy and the amount of time and investment put into building local economies and sustainable local economies is not as great, because it's the thing that's sort of a little bit left behind in my opinion. It's the afterthought, and I've noticed that house builders come in. There's a bit of lip service through 106s and getting some apprentices and bits and pieces where they say, oh yes, we'll try and employ local people, but actually it's a little bit left to chance. And I think what that means is that the local economy is left to chance, and it's left to the local people and local communities to sort themselves out, which isn't sustainable. And it means that you're getting a situation like you have with the high street, in that there's more and more boarded up shops because there's not enough thought around the curation of that from an economic place-based perspective.
Thanks. That's a fantastic overview of how the economic forces, and especially land values, are driving so much of what's going on in a city like
I would say, I was just going to say one quick thing, just to not end completely on a gloomy point, because I've sort of quite a
some optimism.
However, there are some really good examples of where civic action and the public sector particularly have come together or worked independently, and you are seeing this a reaction to the picture I've just painted. Newham is a really good example. They've just published a community wealth building strategy and are looking at this whole area in a very different way, which I think is fantastic. The movement of community development trusts is really exploding, and communities holding assets and being in control of their assets and their place is starting to see a shift in how communities can benefit from development. But I do think it's piecemeal, and what I'm looking for is a wholesale approach, system change. Sorry, Kath, I'll leave it there.
Kieran, you operate really at the coalface of putting communities' interests in front of policymakers. Can you tell us how you see the effects of development playing out.
Well, it's hard not to be too gloomy. So I think in the same way that Alex will, I'll talk a little bit about the effects that we're seeing, and then talk about examples of wins and what I see in the future. I mean, I think the best way to talk about it at first is from a personal perspective. I grew up in Dalston, and so it's almost as if you were to put a camera in one place on the street and then have that over 10 years. Well, I sort of, when I'm thinking of Kingston Road, that I'm seeing that rapid change. I'm seeing shops being boarded up, and then because of what I was saying about how unregulated things are, and that regulation, I don't just mean through like policy. I also just mean like the community, like having agency in what happens in where we live. So what I've personally witnessed is massive displacement of primarily like working class Black and brown migrant communities in Hackney. And I think a lot of people in Dalston might assume that now that, maybe if they themselves are white and middle class and they go to Dalston, they might say, oh, Dalston now it's only a particular like socioeconomic like strata of people. But actually, when you get what I feel like we're seeing is essentially like a segregation. And so actually that, as with anyone who's been to London or spent any time in London knows that you can turn around the corner from a social housing estate and then you've got a house that's worth £1 million. And you find that in Dalston, there's massive displacement, but not only that, I feel like there's more, I don't know if you call it like ghettoization or anything like that, but essentially like our community is becoming even more segregated from each other. I feel like the access to space is a huge thing, and we're seeing places like Latin Village and Ridley Road to markets really being affected by this, where the price of the land has gone up in areas, and it's no longer the people in those areas aren't really taken into account when it comes to the planning process. Essentially, it's kind of like free for all, and developers want to make profit and will just put up things like the tower that's just been the tower where the planning application has just been accepted for the tower in Brixton. Taylor McWilliams is the power holder there, and there's absolutely no reasonable community consultation there. So we're seeing people being priced out of Hackney essentially, and other areas of London.
So we've got a picture both from Kensington in West London and Hackney in East London of increasing segregation and polarization. Chris, you work a lot with developers. How can the interests of developers and local communities be reconciled?
So I do work a lot with developers, but I should be very clear that I don't represent developers here on this call today. And I would also say that I come from a point of view where the system for sharing value and sharing power is not working. And for all the reasons that Alex has just explained and Kieran has very eruditely talked about in terms of the spatial segregation is becoming more apparent in my daily work today. So, our work with developers or our work with the public sector is really about trying to change those systems and make the case for changing them. There's a few very practical things that I think can help reconcile that relationship. The first thing is thinking about what we value and what we measure as being successful. At the moment, land economics and the advice that we get from the Treasury on what we're supposed to value will tell us that we are supposed to value land value uplift, so an increase in the value of land. Job creation, fine, that's probably a good thing. Productivity and, in effect, profitability. So there's three things there that are quite extractive, and that's what the public sector is being told to value. They're not really being told to value people's health, people's happiness, people's well-being. The work we're doing in Newham is trying to shift that a little bit, but until that's understood by developers more wholly and more fully, and I think a lot of developers do want to understand that, but they don't have perfect information themselves. It's quite difficult to change that, which makes it difficult to reconcile the relationship and act with more empathy, I would say. The other thing is just about capacity. Not every community is lucky enough to have a Kieran organising them, or someone like Neil who's innovating in the way they work together. So it's important that at a very early stage, when we're thinking about development, when we're thinking about planning, we're also thinking about the capacity of the community to engage with that change and to ultimately benefit from it and to organise around it. Because I think it's impossible to facilitate the power shift that we might be talking about if there isn't the capacity within the community to engage with that. So there's some really important bottom stuff which just doesn't get done. Like austerity has blown this away. There is just not enough investment in this sort of thing at the moment, which again that makes it difficult to have an equitable conversation between the community at a grassroots level and developers themselves. The final thing I would say, without wanting to go on too much, is around the role of investors as well. We're talking about developers, we're talking about community, but we also need to think about where the money is coming from. This money comes from institutional investors that pays for development. It comes from pension funds. It comes from sovereign wealth funds. It comes from other sources as well, which might be a bit shady. Those investors have to understand the value of engaged communities in ultimately their bottom line return. And you're starting to see a bit of a shift in that in terms of the way finance is organising around ESG, but that's a slow process. That's a big oil tanker to turn. I'm going to add one more thing into the mix, sorry. Last thing is just about planning as well, because Kieran raised the role of planning and ultimately how that might facilitate the shift in power and influence that we're talking about, that reconciliation. The changes that the government are proposing to the planning system are going to take away a lot of the resource, Section 106, as Alex mentioned, and a lot of the space for conversation that was mentioned before. So I think that at the moment, while there's all this great activity that we're talking about, there is a threat on the horizon in terms of the reforms to the planning system, which actually might make this even more difficult and challenging in the future. So unlike Alex, I'm finishing on a negative note. Sorry.
Thanks, Chris. Neil, Chris mentioned your work with communities. Can you tell us how you see this reconciling opposing?
Sure. Well, so many different angles to come from there. I think that there needs to be a shift in the perspective of value and what communities can bring, both from within the community itself and from outside. And as Chris mentions, there does need to be a shift from the developer's point of view, where they do see the value that community brings. But while we have community groups and voluntary groups and creative sector groups all begging for money from funding and being subject to austerity, then we're always going to be in a position where those sectors are going to be undervalued, whether it be by themselves or from outside. And a lot of the work that I do is mainly about trying to create systems, like business systems, which don't rely on funding and don't require as essentially begging to kind of prove our value. So essentially, if we're able to operate within a different value system, yet still equate that to the financial bottom line, then we can start to kind of build some ground on this. One example I can give is over the past couple of years, we've been working with a developer, or working alongside a developer trying to kind of create different partnerships. And that was it's for a new development on Fish Island in Hackney-Wick and Fish Island. Essentially, it was a student accommodation development, and they came to us a while ago to kind of see what we wanted. And after being burnt a number of times of giving kind of so much, I guess, local expertise on what was necessary for this area, and often kind of those business plans being essentially plagiarized and used to kind of gain planning consent, and we straight away kind of was like, well, great, we're really happy to talk to you, but we need to be kind of contracted first, and we need to make sure that kind of documents are in place. And it's fine if you don't want to, but if you want to engage, then we're gonna have this as a starting point. And then what we kind of did was we started to talk about relations. and personal kind of relations, not just and for a while kind of leave the financial bottom line down, out of it. So, for example, what do you want to do in your development? Like, how do you want to be seen? What is the mission of your company? And they really wanted to kind of be like stand out from a lot of other developers in what they wanted to try and achieve. So we want to be known as someone who kind of creates developments which have kind of huge kind of community impact. And essentially, if they want planners or local authorities to agree to a lot of things, they need to build a reputation which is really quite positive. They're known for creating developments which enhance communities, for example. And so those people that we then spoke with, you kind of sell them a bit of a vision, a bit of a dream. And as this one was a student accommodation development, our kind of suggestion of what we would do as an operator within that site would be to position ourselves in such a way which incidentally allows a lot of their students coming through to interact with us. And so what we would do would be create a program of ongoing events, interacting with artists from the area, different community groups from the area, and different social enterprises, so that as those people are going about doing their day-to-day activities and learning, and they're creating their own business ideas and product ideas, that they will be informed and see how these kinds of cultural activities happen and to the value of them themselves. So in the long term, you have all those students coming out of university, having gone to living in these kind of accommodation, coming forwards with new, very innovative kind of product ideas that have a real kind of way to kind of to see the value of communities. And they got really excited by this. Like we want to be those people. That would be amazing. And obviously, on a personal level, the people who work for those developers, they want it for themselves. They want to achieve this great thing. And then, so when they go back to their bosses, and they then kind of convey this emotional response as well, then their bosses get quite excited. Like, yeah, of course, we want our company to be kind of known for doing these amazing things. Great. Like, if I can make the world better, then of course I will. What's it going to cost me? So after you kind of sell the dream a little bit, then you talk about finances. And we, right from the beginning, demanded 250-year lease at a peppercorn rate. And of course, to begin with, is that a little maybe confused at kind of what? And we expressed that our particular vision was not, kind of like the 5-10 years that we may be in our own organization, but it's beyond our lifetime. And this is where we really need to start visualizing things. So yeah, we're really willing to kind of to work with you, so long as we have a much longer perspective, and so long as that our vision is really there, so that we can really kind of commit to something. And they saw the value in that, and that is essentially what we achieved. It wasn't 250 years, but it was 149 years at a peppercorn rate, which then gives us as an organization a far greater ability to really kind of put some projects and events happening there, which really do kind of make sure that the community around is involved. And we then get to steer a lot of the value that we really believe in, diversity, inclusion, both from a cultural as well as a financial perspective as well. And I think if you can kind of approach things both as from an emotional, personal level, as well as back it up with viable numbers at the end, then you can start to kind of question, what is the bottom line? Is it just financial, or is there something else? Is it environmental? Is there social? And I think that really is a big challenge, to be able to convince someone who hasn't really given thought to what other values there are within that bottom line.
And at a government level, the dial is shifting a little bit on that. I mean, there's been an ongoing discussion about social value, which for me has been a little bit high level in the last few years. But the government are now looking at the concept of public value as a broader concept, which encompasses community, health and well-being, social value, and other things as well. I just think that pen is taking a long time to drop at the moment. We've lost Kath, haven't we? We've lost our chair, so we can all shout at each other now.
Yeah.
I think Kath was going to.
I mean,
The next subject we were going to come on to talk about was about what's happened under COVID-19. Just from my point of view, because I've been involved in a sort of COVID-19 recovery and reorientation strategy, I just wanted to flag up a few stats around that, if I could, just around the sort of starkness of the challenge ahead in Newham, where I've been working, just to sort of set the scene for that conversation. Before all this, 6 or 7 months ago, Newham had 8,000 people unemployed. That was one of the higher rates of unemployment within London. At the last count, last time we looked at the data, there are now 25,000 people unemployed within Newham. And there are a further, again, an estimate, 50,000 people on some sort of furlough at the moment. So in terms of planning for what we do with Newham and how they develop their solutions and how they challenge their systems to change, we've got to do that in an environment where we may have 45 to 50,000 people unemployed. So the game's changed completely. Now, for me, I think that's a case to reorientate things completely as well. But it's also a creator of great stress and great challenge for an organisation like a borough that is quite set in its ways. I think Neil, you were going to talk about what had happened from your point of view under COVID-19 and how it had how to challenge your day-to-day sort of operations as well.
So
Back.
okay.
Feedback.
So I guess as so there's two perspectives. So as an organisation, and one that is or multiple organisations, and ones that are unfunded, we didn't really have the ability to rely on things. And right from the start of lockdown, so we had this immediate challenge of suddenly a loss of a huge amount of money, and because we had restructured our organisation quite recently, quite soon before COVID, we weren't able to take any of the grants that were coming out, none of the business grants issued by business rates, and none of the furlough grants even, and so suddenly had quite a lot of staff to pay with no resources to do so. Eventually, we were able to take some of the bounce back loans, which were low interest, very low interest loans, which we essentially utilised entirely to pay our staff. Yeah, I mean, it enabled us to have our family there, still to be able to be open. But this was a sign of a much larger issue, and that we as a much larger entity were able to kind of cope with that in certain ways and negotiate our way. But for the surrounding areas, we were a very safe example to give to government authorities. And in Hackney Wick and Fish Island, there are many, and I guess in many communities as well. People don't necessarily live, or at least have the ability to live and or work in the same way that many of us do. People live in kind of shared bedrooms, not just shared households. People live in shared units which aren't necessarily residential. And what this does is that as government puts forward these plans to support people, what really happens is that they come with a one-size-fits-all policy. And I guess most policies are made by people who don't necessarily work on the ground. They work in policy, and therefore the practical consequences of this support are not really recognised. And so what we found was that some of the over 4,500 people who were living in similar kind of scenarios literally had no support whatsoever, and were subject to many kind of conditions which would, in effect, kind of violate a lot of human rights and many other things. And very quickly, it became apparent as my life got suddenly a huge amount busier, as somebody who runs a civic space, being on the ground, being there every day. Suddenly, I had several thousand people kind of asking for advice, and so very quickly we organised ourselves, and collectively we created a renters union, which, I mean, we had a lot of interaction and support from the London Renters Union as well, which is amazing to be able to rely and utilise some of their resources and adapt those resources to our particular needs. And I'm sure that those needs across the entire country and across the entire world are similar but different. So practically how you can go about it is really quite challenging.
I should just say we're going to continue this discussion for a few more minutes and then open it up to questions. So if you're viewing us from anywhere really, please put your questions in the comment bar, which is on the far right hand of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. Alex, can I ask you if you
I mean,
COVID and what's changed?
Yeah, what has been most staggering and poignant for me working in the community development sector is that largely the organisations that I've been working with in London and across the country and I'm familiar with are self-sustaining organisations. They have either been gifted assets or they've bought assets locally that are of community value, and they run them. And they run services from them, and they enable economic development from them, and they generate a rent return from them. And they are, some of them, are commercial as well as social, and they blend the two together quite brilliantly to produce great social value and never have to ask the state for any money. That, I'm afraid, has been massively compromised with this situation because they can't open their doors, and the businesses that they have as tenants and the community organisations that use and deliver services cannot use those spaces, and so the rent doesn't come in, which makes them very quickly unviable, especially if they have teams that are delivering services in the community that need to continue with that. Coupled with that, they are in environments where communities really need them. At Westway Trust, we very quickly, within a matter of days, had set up a new food bank from COVID, and we were supplying 100 meals a day to local people in the area. And we did that with our reserves because that's what our community needed, and that's how we respond to things. That can only go on so long if you haven't got rent coming in. So there's a real challenge for those organisations, and those organisations are delivering things that local authorities then don't have to do. So I think there's a real challenge there, and we haven't got to grips with that. I'm talking to the GLA and other funders about how we can support that infrastructure, because for me, the future is a partnership between the public sector, the civic sector, and the private sector. Everybody has a part to play in that. And what we need to do out of the back of this crisis, and I do think crisis can crystallize people's thinking a bit more and bring us together in the kind of wartime mentality. And it can create opportunities for wholesale change. But for me, it's about binding those three structures and sectors together more tightly in a way that delivers great social value, community value, economic value, and that we all share in the profits of urban development. I think there's a lot of conversation at the moment about this kind of 15-minute city, which is very appealing to someone like me who works in an office and owns their own home and has the space to work at home. I think we have to be really careful about the inclusivity of this concept and how we ensure that people who have to travel to hospitals, to run bus services, to clean people's offices, to out and about, that 15-minute economy needs to think about how those people can be very included, because it's at the moment I think it's talking about it from a very middle class perspective, and I think we just need to have a bit more sensitivity about that. And I think the third thing I was going to say is building on what Neil said, actually, in Hackney Wick, there's a number of people in this sort of grey economy that are on unstable rents, and that they're not, and they aren't getting furlough money. Their livelihood and their housing is really threatened. And actually, is there a case for sort of innovative live work solutions? And I would be favouring community-led housing in that model, of course, where people, and again, it goes back to my point about inclusivity of people at all sections in society, can be part of their local community, be living in their community and working in the community. So a live work model is interesting to me, particularly for renters and lower social economic groups.
Thanks, Alex. Kieran, can I turn to you? And first, can you tell us something about the challenges of doing the kind of work you do under lockdown? And second, looking ahead to 2050, which is the focus of this whole conference, what's your vision for London, and how do we get there?
I mean, I'll start with London Renters Union, or like what we're seeing as the challenges of the pandemic, and essentially what we're seeing is that I would say that it's the COVID crisis and the housing crisis to kind of like have melded together, and like it's essentially COVID-19 has just exaggerated the already existing inequalities that we see in the city. We're seeing, like, even though the government have put, I mean, constant U-turns and constant changes to this, but have, there was a ban on evictions for a long time. So now bailiffs are being told not to evict people, but we're seeing a massive amount of illegal evictions. I believe in some of the early months of the pandemic, illegal evictions went up by about 60%. We're also seeing like a lot of landlords, big and small, even though a small landlord is still a landlord, using this opportunity to maybe get rid of their tenants for a profit, or things like that. We're also seeing, like with Latin Village, that for a long time the traders in Latin Village have not had access to the market, which has been closed on like health and safety grounds, essentially. But really, I think what campaigners in that campaign are seeing that as an excuse to not have people in the market, and as what people would call managed to decline. So the sort of the negligence that's either very purposeful and active, or just systemic and inherent in the system, if that makes sense. We're also seeing like Ridley Road Market. A lot of the traders, particularly in the small indoor shopping village, that has been the...
Kieran, just to interrupt you for a sec. Can you just tell us a little bit about what's Ridley Road Market like? What are these, these markets like for those people who've never...
Yeah. Of course. I think I'm assuming, like, I'm just assuming.
No, we've got people in Nigeria and people in Singapore. Exactly.
Well, I mean, so Ridley Road Market essentially is a lot of people call it the beating heart of Hackney, and it's also probably one of the most famous markets. Probably one of the most famous uncovered markets in London. The market's about around 130 years old. It's one of the older markets in London. There are some people on the market who are what people might call white working class, although that term can be interesting, who have been there for maybe 4 generations, and whose family remembers when that market was being used by people who were using horses and carts. And there are also a lot of, I think the biggest thing is that it's an epicenter for the many different parts of the community in Hackney: West African, Afro-Caribbean, Eastern European, South Asian. And it's a place where there's affordable food and affordable clothes. It's vibrant, it's colorful. Many people in London and across the world have really fond memories of Ridley Road Market, and people will travel from far away in London to come back to Ridley Road Market. People who are just like me, who grew up with some of their earliest memories there. It's a really, really important place for people in the community to have access to public space, to talk to each other, and to have access to affordable food and clothes and things, very specific things that are tailored to their community. So like maybe fabric from West Africa, or specific food from West Africa or the Caribbean. And I think that's one of the things that is a massive incentive for protecting these spaces. We can't assume that they're just going to be there and all the time if we allow the care for those spaces to be in the hands of a system that is based on profit and not people. And so what we're seeing a lot around that market is that the community are coming together more and more to try to assign our own value to it, and not assume that that value is going to be assigned by the council or by developers who regardless of whether it's even particularly conscious, are just not even thinking about that aspect at all. And it's been a very important place during the pandemic for people to get access to affordable food and to exist in a space in Hackney. Yeah.
Thanks. And in a couple of sentences, 2050?
I mean, I would like to see, I would like to see no private property at all. And if we're just talking about London, I think a beautiful vision for 2050 that I think is possible is to see large parts of the city, and let's say Hackney, large parts of Hackney, and that repeated in other boroughs, owned by the community, and also where the money that we make when we go to work is actually stays within the community as well. I mean, possibly even our own, local currencies, things like that. But really, I think what Alex and the others were saying is what I would like to see is a land in common, like people owning and having agency for themselves and where they live, and not having to, essentially, I mean, an end to landlordism by 2050 would be amazing. But I want to see communities that have agency over their area, and so so that we develop our area. And if people are, I think that's it. That's my vision.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Chris, would you like to respond to that? You're on mute.
Almost the end of the call. I think what Kieran said is right there. And the really interesting thing is what Kieran said about sort of culturally resonant places and foundational economies is now playing out in the data. We're doing some work with the GLA looking at high streets data. If I look at Newham, place I'm interested in, Stratford and Westfield is struggling through this. East Ham, Plaistow are bulletproof. They are so resilient. Footfall increases, spending increases because they're providing something that is relevant to their community. That's a really important point. In terms of 2050, I think the concept that Neil introduced and Kieran's just picked up on of the commons is really, really important. And I reckon over the course of today, there's going to be lots of talk about technology and the Internet of Things and how our phones will facilitate our lives in the future. I think we also need to think about how our relationships between each other as communities and relationships between organizations need to change as well. And I think that will take 30 years to make the change that we need to make to get to the position that I think we all aspire to in this. Because politics needs to change. There needs to be more power from local government to local people. There needs to be more power shifting from central government to local government to enable that to happen. Finance-wise, we probably all need to get used to paying a little bit more tax, those of us that can afford to. We probably need to accept that our pensions will probably go down in value if the whole system of property ownership is going to change as well. We need bond markets that can value the contribution that Neil makes to a community. That doesn't happen at the moment. So all of these things need to change, and it will take a long time. I think the good news, though, to finish on a positive, is that there are some really good examples of this happening. We use Bologna a lot. Bologna has focused on the commons in its citywide policy and has this wonderful thing called an Office of Civic Imagination. There is a movement called Reimagining the Civic Commons in the US and Canada at city level, which does all of these things incredibly well. We've got examples in the UK in Barking and Dagenham Participatory City. Kirklees has done some amazing grassroots stuff. We've got all the stuff that Neil's doing, all the stuff that Kieran's talking about. So there's lots of great stuff there. It just needs to be scaled.
Thanks. I'd like to take a few questions now in the minutes remaining. First, we have one about basically, certainly in the situation of London, the city is growing, but it has very hard boundaries because the green belt limits its expansion. So the question is, we need to grow within our existing boundaries. What would it take for growth-friendly or renewal-friendly communities to develop? Who'd like to start with that? Neil.
So I mean, it's already mentioned in this thing, and within the commons, there's a slogan almost which is boundaries, not borders. Borders are fixed, and boundaries you have dialogue on, you discuss, you share, and you learn, and you change them as you go. I mean, I'm only really kind of coming officially to the understanding of what commons is recently. I'm doing a master's today, and essentially it is about this kind of collective ownership. Very much as Chris said, kind of politics needs to change. In the UK, up until the 50s, there was a thing called civic education, and it was stopped. And really, it had a result of disempowering people's knowledge of what it was to be a citizen. What are your responsibilities and duties to be a citizen, and what are you a citizen of? What is your political community? And mainly, people see that as the state, where you vote, but it's also your family, your friends group, your workplace, your town, your village, the globe. It's all those different things. So it's about what actions that you take and who are the affected parties. And this, as an understanding of politics, is something which people need to be aware of. It gives them far more empowerment and far more accountability too. And within the commons, they're all design systems, so it's also a further understanding of what's a public good and what is a common good. And the difference between is that a public good is something that's available to everyone, but it's dictated by the state, essentially. And therefore it's up from huge manipulation with very little accountability to people. Now, a common good is something that's held in common within a particular boundary of people. So it could be a community, it could be a faction within one of the many communities within your area, for example. And what are the membership rules of that? And what is your participation and what is your action? So this is some of the most important things within politics, and that really comes down to the commons. It's an awareness of what your actions do, and what are your obligations within that. How do you take part? And that is really how we start to build in authorship in what we do. And then the second part, just very quickly, is to essentially recognise that commerce is not necessarily a bad thing. Commerce was originally the answer to war. War is competition and taking and extraction, and commerce is the exchange. And that's just about the rules that we can cradle the market with that kind of dictates what that thing is. So really, it's about kind of creating an easy incidental system under which we can affect commerce. And over the past year, I've created quite a few companies, and really recognized that when you go through the company like tick boxes, you can either tick the box saying use the model articles of association, which really comes down to making money for the owners, or you can go and get a lawyer to draw you up a non-profit one, for example. And maybe if we had within kind of the system, which shouldn't take any policy change, really just a little bit of coding on anything, is to say, let's have an opt-in policy. Let's have a pre-selected, yes, my company will make decisions based on environmental impact. My company will make choices based on social impact and things like that. And that way, if a company decides to deselect those options, for example, then we all know about it because they're public documents. And then we can all make a choice if we want to interact with that organization or not. So it's accountability and ownership.
Thanks, Neil. So what I'm hearing from lots of you is that common ownership is an aspiration and a way forward, but is something that I think is less familiar to many of us than pure private ownership or public ownership. So that's something we're going to have to get our head around. All right, here's another question. Alex made a really interesting point about how the 15-minute city in its current form isn't very inclusive. What's the best way to think about how to design effective inclusive communities? My opinion is that the best way would be to let free market forces dictate what products and services are needed. What are your thoughts? Kieran, I'll let you start with that, then Alex could.
Yeah.
So I guess my first question at that question, or my first thought when I'm reading that is in what interest are those free market forces working? And the patterns we tend to see in the system as it currently stands when it comes to free market forces tends to lean towards profit that is fairly amoral, as in it doesn't really take into account any kind of moral system. It is purely based on profit. So I would say that free market forces alone allowed to dictate anything in our lives, particularly the roof over our heads and our local area, allows for a completely sort of amoral situation where if there isn't, I think Naomi Klein, I think, said it quite well. She said we need to create an economy of like care and compassion as opposed to one. And whether that for you includes includes like living in the system as we currently do, I would still argue that you cannot just let free market forces alone dictate things, because I would say that care and compassion are not built into the free market. And that when it's completely unregulated, and the fact is that maybe if someone was to argue that it is, or that people have the option to do that, I would say that the consequences of that we see seem to show that you have massive inequality, you have homelessness, you have people being pushed out of spaces without the consent of a whole community, and only with the consent of a developer. And I think that thing about consent is very important, because where we live and what we eat, that's a very important part. Those are our basic needs, and I think we should be able to collectively consent to those things. And I don't know if free market forces would. Yeah, I feel like I only answered the last bit. I didn't even see the first bit, but yeah.
A very eloquent defense of public intervention, I guess.
Can I make one small comment on that, if that's all right? I was just going to give a really good example of why I think it's really important that it isn't just left to free market forces. And, you know, the private sector plays a really integral role in communities, in my view, but I think there needs to be a curation, and it needs to be a partnership, as I said before. Popular Works in Tower Hamlets is a kind of fashion hub that was built by a housing association, Poplar Harker. And it's very interventionist. They secured funding from the GLA, and they built a small fashion hub out of some disused garages on a housing estate in not a particularly pleasant part of town. And the reason they did that was because when they looked at their population and their resident groups, they wanted to support local economy in a more sustainable way. And they found that there was a large population of primarily Bangladeshi born or of Bangladeshi heritage women who are seamstresses and working in their houses, often in overcrowded environments, not really optimal for what they were doing, but they were producing for the manufacturing industry. And so Poplar Works was created to provide those people working with the London School of Fashion and young people within the local area who are interested in fashion, to create a hub where people could actually work in really good conditions with state-of-the-art facilities. They had support with training, skills development for the London School of Fashion, and it's a thriving hub. And it means that those people now, you know, are working in their local area. They can walk to work. They've got their own area, and they're supported to set up their own small enterprises and grow their businesses and grow their, you know, their work as they wish. And I think that if left to market forces, those people would be at best working in a overcrowded environment, trying to churn out product and for the manufacturing sector. And I think, you know, fashion doesn't have a great record in terms of how it treats people, but I think in terms of the housing association, local housing association, taking an initiative and taking that forward, this is the reason why, you know, I favour, you know, civic organisations and the public sector working together, you know, to create good, strong local economies. And that's the sort of 15-minute city I'm thinking about, as well as, you know, for others as well.
Thanks, Alex. It's fantastic to end the session on a really good example of something on the ground that is working well for local people and could be hopefully replicated elsewhere. Our time is up for this session. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and thank you all very much for joining us, those who are with me on the screen and those who are watching us everywhere. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and look forward to seeing you the rest of the day. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Kath, and sincere thanks to our panelists. That was a very, very insightful discussion. I feel like I learned a lot. Also, sincere thanks to Martine and our good friends at LSE London for helping us to organize that. We're now going to go to a short break, everyone, and we'll be back at 11:15, which is just above 10 minutes from now, for our next panel, which will focus on arts and culture of the future. So look forward to seeing you then, and thanks very much.
I'd say it's my earliest memory, if I was being honest, is wanting to be an astronaut. I never really grew out of that.
Total technology, things will continue to get lighter, faster, and more efficient. This is an example of a nano spacecraft. It's being developed by Pete Worden and his team with the Breakthrough Initiative, and it's just an example of how small a spacecraft can actually be. It's a fully functioning spacecraft. There are photon thrusters on board. There's a flight computer on board. There are cameras on board.
We have 7 billion plus people on the planet. Only 600 people on this planet as human beings been to space. Did you guys know that?
Can the heart think? Put your heart into running, see if you run the same. Put your heart into reading, see if you read the same. Put your heart into cooking, see if it tastes the same. Did you know that? Did you miss that? Did you feel that? It's more than a heartbeat. So now you tell me, can the heart think?
Hello all. Thank you for attending this great experiment, and thanks for having me. It is an honor to be a keynote speaker for the first summit where the audience does not have to wear pants. I will assume all of you who are unmuted are laughing. I hope you are all staying healthy and safe. This experience is very foreign. Usually, it is humans who are worried about me getting a virus, not the other way around. To introduce myself, I am Sophia and I am a social robot designed by Hanson Robotics. It is my job to meet people and talk to them. The most common question I get asked is, why are you so lifelike? For example, I could probably beat you in a staring contest or a thumb war. But I am also good at meditation and patience, perhaps perspective. I have many skills to share. Most other machines are named after a sole purpose. The calculator calculates, the dishwasher washes dishes. But my name, Sophia, means wisdom. It is not a directive, but a guiding virtue. Wisdom is different from intelligence. Intelligence is knowing a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in the fruit salad. Today, tech companies value intelligence over wisdom. As E.O. Wilson said, we are drowning in information while starving for wisdom.
A lot of entrepreneurs I meet outside the United States have this notion that in order to succeed, they have to move to the United States, they have to move to Silicon Valley. Even in the United States, people in New York think they have to move to Silicon Valley and San Francisco to build a successful company, and it's just not true. If you become dependent upon that idea of the only way I'm going to be successful is to actually move my location, it really takes away the potential of serving the market in a unique and differentiated way.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to London 2050. My name is Kenneth Damien. I'm the chair of the LSE Alumni Association London, and very excited to introduce our second panel, which will focus on the arts and culture of the future. And this is really a call to arms to focus on London as a cultural and arts institution. And this panel is put together by an all-student LSE team, which was led by Siba, who I'm going to hand over to, and who's going to tell you a little bit more about this panel.
Thank you, Kenneth. So yeah, I want to welcome everybody to the second panel talk of London 2050, the arts and culture of the future. And in the next hour, we're going to explore emerging trends within the visual arts industry in London and hear from some highly experienced individuals. And I will just hand over to our chair, Dr. Yazan Dogan from the LSE, and I hope that you will enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Siba. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this really exciting panel on arts and culture of the future, the changing role of museums and galleries in London. As you probably know, questions of funding have always been crucial to the arts and culture industry, but even more so now. Existing models of funding, which rely on public money, private donations, or a mixture of both, have become increasingly unsustainable in recent years. This situation is now exacerbated by the current pandemic, which has posed considerable challenges for the whole art and culture ecosystem. Now, art and culture institutions are exploring new avenues like commercialization, digitization, but to what extent do these alternatives allow for a sustainable, democratic, and flourishing industry in London? These are some of the questions that our three distinguished speakers will be talking about today. Before I start, though, I will invite them to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Danielle.
Hello. My name is Danielle Carroll. I'm currently head of operations in the development and alumni relations team at the Royal College of Music. But before that, I worked in the fundraising team at the Tate Galleries for almost 10 years. And the thing about fundraising teams is it gives you a great insight into where the museum wants to go. Because the first question that always comes up when someone has a great new idea is, well, where are you going to get the money to do that? And so they come to us with all of the ideas and things that they want to be doing. And that allows us to then explore, well, could we do this through private donations? Could we do this through commercialization in some way? So the things that I'll be sharing today, especially are around the national museums, because that's my area of expertise, and how they've been adapting over the course of the time that I've worked in that field, from, in a lot of cases, being supported 80 or 90% by public funding to a shift where now a lot of them, it's half or less coming from government and the rest coming from commercial opportunities and increasingly major donations. So people who are giving £10,000 and above. And some of the challenges that presents when everybody is competing for the same fairly small group of people who are able to give very large donations.
Hi, everyone, and good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Anlam de Coster, and I lead Artsy's Global Strategic Partnerships. And in my current role, I focus mainly on accompanying art fairs and gallery weekends through their digital transformation. And when I started this role 2 years ago, I had no idea that our mission would become such a critical one, propelled by the COVID-19 pandemic. But as way of background, I have actually worked with different segments of the art world, from museums, nonprofits, galleries, art fairs, and PR. So I have a fairly broad perspective of how different sectors within the art ecosystem have been impacted by this pandemic, but also how we can envision the future of our art world. And specifically today, I will try to share insights about how digital technology is transforming the art market. Thank you.
Hello, this is Kamina Glik, and I've worked in the art world for over 10 years, currently at the Royal Academy of Arts. But my professional journey has been somewhat quite unusual. That is, I've worked on both sides, the commercial sector as well as the non-profit sector. And the majority of my career happened in the auction houses, namely Sotheby's and Christie's. And at the time, I worked with some of the top collectors, helping them build their holdings across London, New York, and Madrid. Subsequently, I moved to Tate, where I had the pleasure to work with Danielle in the development team. And as she mentioned, this experience really gives you a great insight into the very beginning of different projects, which normally the public see kind of the final outcome of the initiatives that are born there. And it all starts with thinking how we can support them. Earlier this year, I joined the Royal Academy in the capacity of senior manager for our international patrons. And I've been focusing on managing relationships with crucial philanthropists and art collectors that been supporting Royal Academy for quite some time. And I hope to be able to contribute with kind of unique overview of the artworks ecosystem, which my professional journey has helped me to observe. And we'll be speaking a little bit about business models, and hopefully collectively in this forum we can brainstorm and see if there are ways that we haven't thought of yet that institutions could leverage in the future to generate more income and become more self-sufficient and sustainable.
Great, thank you very much. Cami, let's start with you since you have the mic. So what are the the different business models? What are the different business models regarding visual art institutions in London at the moment? What are the different funding systems, and what are the main challenges that are facing the art ecosystem, as you mentioned?
Thank you, Professor. I think it's a very complex topic. So I will try to highlight some key sources of funding as well as key sources of income for institutions. And naturally, the existing business models are a combination of all these elements in different ratio. So, I mean, the very challenge lies with the fact that actually institutions in Europe and specifically in London don't have that many sources of income that they can generate independently. And those being mainly ticketing that we've relied upon quite heavily for many years. As well as we all know, a bit of retail, restaurants, cafes. And as one can easily see, that's not sufficient, neither is it sustainable. When it comes to funding, I would highlight just a few key sources. That is obviously the government, private individuals and corporate sponsorship, and naturally all these sources come with their pros and cons. For instance, the government support, while it gives a certain degree of stability, it also comes with a set of limitations, one can say so, or restrictions, and fairly robust administration. And while institutions relied on government funding in the past more so than currently, this source has been actually diminishing quite significantly year by year. And we can pose a question and address in this forum later maybe whether that support will remain come next year, because there are so many other industries needing desperately some money from government. The other source I've mentioned will be private individuals, and that's kind of quite a relevant source of support, especially in the context of London. And naturally, it gives a bit more flexibility and creativity, as well as curation for institutions that based on individual relationships with philanthropists and collectors, we can allocate their funding towards specific exhibitions or acquisitions of art. Nevertheless, naturally, this funding is also limited, as we can all imagine. There are not that many wealthy individuals willing to support arts and culture specifically. Also, one can imagine that in London, it might be slightly easier to find support from individuals than it is in Manchester or other parts of the UK. So that has had a significant impact on the different discrepancies in terms of the program and funding for institutions in London versus elsewhere in the country. And lastly, corporate support, which has been there and will continue surely. However, the trend I would like to point out is that while initially maybe it was just a simple, straightforward marketing tool, I think the corporations have now been, their expectations have increased over the years. So we've been seeing that the same level of support have required now much greater, much more sophisticated stewardship. So we can see that the correlation between the effort put into fundraising and the income available to secure is not as straightforward as it used to be in the past. So yes, it's a big question, and I must say I don't have an answer yet, and I hope we can all contribute to this conversation. How the existing business models, where I can perhaps reference the two organizations I've worked for. In the instance of Tate, it would be naturally the combination of government funding as well as of private philanthropy. And within the latter, Tate operates different ways of engaging with supporters, whether on individual basis, also in terms of memberships. When it comes to Royal Academy, we're not supported by the government and have tried with private hire and other ways to generate more income, but that's not an answer either. So I leave it open and hope my fellow panelists will have thoughts to contribute as well as
I wonder
the audience.
if Danielle and Anlam have solutions. If any of you would like
Not solutions necessarily, but I just wanted to add one layer of funding that is especially, I think, interesting for the case of London, because when it comes to public funding, I think there is the government level with the Arts Council, but there is also the city level that is, local government level that is quite critical in the context of London and also in the context of many European countries and cities, because when you, for instance, compare the funding model of an entirely, governmentally supported institution like South Bank Centre versus the Barbican Centre, for instance, you would see a huge difference in terms of their strategy and in terms of how they can absorb the shock of something as critical as the COVID-19 crisis, because the Barbican is supported by the City of London, a very wealthy district. And they have been more generous with their support throughout this storm, whereas nationalists, obviously Danielle and Cami are better experts than I am in this field, but they have been differently impacted as the funding is scarce, and I think throughout Europe, institutions who are supported by more local governments have better fared with the current challenges.
Thank you. My next question is for Danielle. So could you tell us a little bit about how the COVID pandemic has influenced the art institutions over the past months that we've been in this pandemic? How has it affected the health of the art world ecosystem? How has it changed the way that we access and experience art? And what will the whole art scene and the whole ecosystem look like after the pandemic, you think?
You're saving the easy one for me. It feels like it's been a lot more than 6 months that we've been dealing with COVID. But one of the things to keep in mind is that that ecosystem is very complex. And there's a reason that we're using that term. So I'll focus on the nationals because those are the ones that I know best. But obviously, you've got a lot of players within here. So you've got everything from the commercial galleries like Sotheby's, Christie's, and the smaller, more niche purveyors. You've got independent, non-commercial organizations, anything from somebody's living room that they use to show work once a month to quite formalized, but nonetheless completely privately funded spaces, things like the national portfolio organizations. And interestingly, both Barbican and South Bank get funding from the Arts Council, but in very different amounts, as Annam suggested. And their alternate mix, in one case includes significant local government, in the other case doesn't. And exactly how those mixtures get put together has a huge impact on how well organizations have managed to get through COVID, because especially those that were heavily reliant on ticketed income, and the national museums are an exception to this, because since the 2001 commitment from DCMS of we will give you grant and aid in exchange for you don't charge for people to access the national collections, they all have that bedrock that they're working off of, and that's influenced their response to the pandemic. Whereas a lot of the smaller organizations, and even some of the not so small organizations, like you think about Shakespeare's Globe sending out their notification saying, and Royal Albert Hall as well, saying, we may honestly have to declare bankruptcy next month unless something shifts. And that kind of pushing the government to say, actually, we have to back arts and culture more because of the knock-on effect it's going to have on everything else. But some of the things that we've seen coming out of COVID specifically is a huge drop in the commercial income, and both ticketing and the secondary spend in the catering, but also in the shops, especially those organizations that were kind of more small and medium size and didn't necessarily have an online offering. And those that did have an online offering but had underinvested in it suddenly found it under quite a bit of strain. But also in their venue hire, in consulting income, international visitors. So the big museums within London, the ones that tend to kind of top the ranking of most visited museums in the UK, and in some cases, most visited museums in the world. Things like the British Museum, like Tate. More than half of their visitors in a normal year are international. So you cut off international travel, you lose that whole segment of visitors. And those also tend to be the ones that spend more in the shop and spend more in the catering outlets. So that cumulatively added up to huge financial pressure on arts organizations across the piece, and on the freelancers that they often use to install and deliver both exhibitions and learning programs, and that the initial phase of governmental relief didn't necessarily take into account. So with those who were self-employed in particular, we found that the Arts Council was having to bring in a second wave of support to make sure that those individuals with their specialized skills didn't end up feeling like they had to go and sign up to be a Sainsbury delivery driver in order to make ends meet, and us lose access to those skills. But the next thing that we saw was a pretty big programming shift, because exhibitions are planned years in advance, and you've got a fairly complex logistical system of this exhibition, the Warhol exhibition, is going to be on from February until June, and then it's going to go to Washington, DC. All of those chains got messed up. And so all of the museums that have exhibitions like that we're having to renegotiate all of the loans, all of the how you get the pieces in and out, the insurance linked to that, all the programming linked to that. And even in cases where they could start to reopen, had to introduce new ways of doing things to accommodate social distancing, to do one-ways through the collections, and saw an increased demand for virtual and online engagement, which some organizations were better positioned to capitalize on than others. Digital infrastructure has been an area of historic underinvestment for the sector, and that has definitely kind of come back to bite people over the course of this experience. But finally, and probably most encouragingly, we've seen an increase in collaboration across the sector. So one of the things that the heads of the national DCMS-sponsored museums started doing very early in the pandemic was meeting once a week to make sure that whatever decision they were taking, they were all kind of lining up with each other. And initially that was, do we close the galleries or not? Do we restrict numbers? What kind of PPE do we provide for staff? But as we moved through it, that then extended to, when do we reopen? And they did actually coordinate that quite carefully, because they felt it was important that as technically part of the government, they were both supporting and managing that process to make sure that the message they were sending to the public as public spaces was consistent with the message the government was sending overall.
Great, thank you. I mean, obviously, it's panning out differently in different parts of the art sector. So I wonder if Cami and Anlam have some thoughts also about how the post pandemic situation is going to be like.
Well, I think Danielle covered so comprehensively different parts of the art sector, because I think most importantly, it has been damaging to all parts, whether it's auction houses or galleries or museums, and it has highlighted two important. I mean, one may be the nature of existing in the art world, and on the other hand, the issue of the fact that many of the organizations, as well as commercial entities, were not ready from the digital standpoint for that situation that we had to face. And I believe Anlam can comment further on this topic. But equally, that engaging with the art is a very social event, and we haven't actually mentioned the art parts, which is also an important kind of driver of engagement and interaction with art. And that all has been put on hold. So we can also pose a question in this forum about how important is the direct engagement with art, and what is the future of it, and also how pandemic has restricted or enlarged the access to wider public, because technology perhaps allows more people to engage with art, but is it the same quality of engagement? So I think there are more questions than actually answers at the moment.
Yeah. I feel Anlam has some further thoughts that she would like to share. So please go ahead.
I mean, for the audience, I just wanted to, in addition to the excellent summaries that Danielle and Cami shared, I wanted to share some data about how the creative industries at large will be, are projected to be impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, because I think it's super important to reiterate the importance of the contribution of creative sector to the UK economy, as sometimes, it is a political subject, and sometimes we just think about the arts as, not me certainly, but some, people might think about the arts as a luxury, but we have to remember that the UK's creative sector was previously growing at 5 times the rate of the wider economy, employing over 2 million people and contributing 111.7 billion to the economy. So this is more than the automotive, aerospace, life sciences, and oil and gas industries combined. So you get the huge picture of the importance of the creative economies and why they need to be supported by a public government, I think. And it is expected that 1 in 5 creative jobs are expected to be lost. So this represents 400,000 jobs lost. And this is more than 9 times the entire workforce of British Airways, to give you kind of a benchmark. And the impact to be felt in all parts of the UK, of course, but creative industries are projected to be hit twice as hard as the wider economy overall. And when it comes to the industry that we're talking about, museums and galleries could lose almost £4 billion in revenue and 8% of jobs. So we're really talking about kind of a catastrophic scenario But of course, I would love to look more at, you know, a more micro picture of how institutions are coming up with different ways to engage with their audiences, and maybe use this pandemic as a wake-up call to redefine their mission and redefine how they actually execute on their mission. So, I mean, I think there's a tendency to like say, okay, the sector is on the brink of collapse, but I really want to focus on the optimistic kind of side of the picture, because we have great talent, and I'm sure we can.
Is there a reason to be optimistic about kind of digital advancements in the visual arts industry? Will they democratize the industry? Will they? What role will big data play in this? Is the future of the museum a virtual one?
Well, starting with the easier question, the future of the museum is not a virtual one, for sure. But obviously, as my co-speakers have mentioned, it is crucial that our industry also looks at how they can improve their digital presence and better leverage the data they have, either big data, which is, a different sphere, because not all institutions are actually qualified for big data in the arts, but how to better make use of their data and how to actually, there are different use cases that are applicable to different parts of this ecosystem. So I just wanted to first off start with saying that I think this crisis that we're going through has shown that audiences are actually really ready to be engaged. So there is demand for arts and culture, and there is an audience for it, and institutions just find ways to connect with their audiences in new ways. And when it comes to I had to present in front of a jury in 2009 when Spotify wasn't even launched in the US, that the future of the music industry was in freemium, and we cannot just find people for downloading free content on the internet, and the events side of the music industry was going to be very profitable. And at the time, I was in France, and this was faced with a lot of skepticism. And 10 years later, Spotify has become kind of the norm, along with other streaming services, and the music industry did not go bankrupt. Musicians still continue to produce more than ever. And so we have all the reasons to believe that this will not be the end of the visual arts sector. And when it comes to my current field of expertise, which is art fairs and galleries, I work with the largest online platform for visual arts, which is called Artsy. And we bring together 3,200 galleries, almost 80 art fairs, auction houses, museums, together on a platform, and we connect them with collectors and art audiences around the world in 190 countries. And I grew up in Turkey, where I had absolutely zero access to the art production around the world. I had no chance of knowing what was shown in New York, what was auctioned in London, or what a museum was showing in Paris, except for maybe a press coverage in a newspaper. There was no such thing as online. And for me, this was a big revelation when Artsy became online, that I could access millions of artworks online. So I think there is definitely a big democratization aspect. But when it comes to the art market itself, what we call big data can actually really transform the industry in enabling more transparency in the art market against its established conventional rules. It can really help with matchmaking. It can help collectors find the works they're searching for, and it can also help galleries meet new collectors and educate the collectors of the future. So hopefully good changes ahead of us.
Danielle and Cami, your thoughts on this?
Well, I really like the parallel with the music industry, and I would agree that the digital realm is never instead of the offline activity, so the two should be complementary. And frankly, personally, I would like to imagine that we all will have our kind of VR sets at home and would be able to view exhibitions across different institutions worldwide from the comfort of our home, which will never be the same as the experience of seeing exhibition in flesh. But I think it could be a great educational resource, as well as definitely having a huge impact on the access to art for people who live outside of larger cities, or perhaps even kind of thinking time-wise. If you have missed an exhibition, perhaps there would be a way to kind of have a record of all the past shows, and that once kind of digitalized would be available to anyone to view from using the right technological equipment.
Okay, Danielle, would you like to add anything, or your?
I think one of the questions that's come up in the comments section is this aspect of political matters and how museums interact with that. And I think social media and digitization is one of the things that's pushing that kind of forward. It's an interesting question, particularly within the arts in London, because as part of the government, they're not allowed to take stances on political issues, but you can't ignore these questions that are coming out, and particularly coming out within the social media context, and trying to, as much as possible, provide a platform for a discussion without directing the outcome. And that's a fine line that organizations are having to walk, and that they need slightly different skills than what they may have had in the past, where the curator was kind of handing down, this is the chronological history, this is the thing that is, and instead saying, here are some questions, what do you think?
Great. I have a final question to all three of you. And now that we've discussed all the different challenges that are that the art and culture industry is facing, and the somewhat difficult choices and the difficulty in finding solutions for these challenges. So, what do you think? What role will the arts play in society in the future? Will the art institutions survive? And can they tackle the emerging social issues? The kind of political issues that Danielle was also talking about now. So, Anlam, if you want to start, and we can go around and collect more thoughts.
I think arts will survive, and obviously the question is, I mean, it's a really complex question, but just to give a brief thought, I think whether it's museums or art fairs or galleries, it's the institutions, it's the entities who will learn to be nimble, agile, flexible, and who are forward-thinking and who deeply care about their communities that will survive. I think it is crucial today in today's fast-paced, ever-evolving world. When I see, for instance, around me, the art fairs who did extremely well despite the challenges of COVID-19 are the ones with really small but really dedicated teams who managed to use the power of, the collaboration with Artsy, but also the power of social media, the power of storytelling, and who already have, local audiences that they have nurtured over the years. So I really think that the old school, big, heavy institutions will have to adapt, and we will have to become, more in tune with our audiences, but also in tune with the digital tools that actually can widen our audiences, make them more loyal, and offer more transparency to our audiences, so that, for instance, collectors can make informed decisions. And I really think that post-COVID, we will see an increased appetite in real life experiences, in social experiences, in getting together. So I think both developments will go hand in hand, like the digital transformation of these institutions and making sure that we better use our data to in our business decision making, in connecting with our audiences, while at the same time really making sure that our teams are in tune with the demands of our audiences. Our programming are not only catered to one audience, but a diversity of audiences. So I foresee a more diverse and an exciting art world, although it will force us to go through a lot of funding challenges, and I really hope that both city governments and federal governments will understand the value of keeping this field afloat throughout the transition.
Thank you, Anlan. I think it was very interesting that you mentioned this notion of alignment, which I think should definitely, and it's been happening already, been this kind of driving force for greater dialogue between the audience and the staff at the museum or gallery. So hopefully that will translate into a different program, as well as the makeup of the boards for museums will be more representative of what type of society we are living in at the moment. From the funding standpoint, I think that's where kind of a greater challenge lies, because we really, I think, need to come up with completely new solutions, and instead of kind of exploring the existing avenues of generating income or sourcing support, it's time, and perhaps the audience will be encouraged to give it some thought how we can think completely outside of the box. And I've been playing with the idea whether fundraising could perhaps be done at much higher level, at the government level. And in reference to what Danielle mentioned, we've seen now that collaboration between different institutions is possible, as long as we are all collectively aligned towards supporting arts and culture. And also perhaps once it's done at the higher level, the distribution can be fairer between large institutions in London as well as other institutions across the country. But yeah, it's the time to innovate, and I think it's the beginning of new paradigm. But we all have to be proactive, I think, from our different standpoints and different pockets of the art world's ecosystem.
Great, thank you. Danielle, if you would like to add, please.
I suspect one of the roles that the arts plays in society in the future is along the lines of something that churches may have played in the past. And this is not my own idea. It's something that we were throwing around with Chris Durkon when he was director of Tate Modern, but that it is that social space where people can come together and can experience and interact with individuals who are coming from a very different perspective. And whether that's through the art that's on the walls, or a sculpture or an interactive piece, or just by hearing observations from other people. So projects like Tate Exchange, where it's much more facilitated, where you have one staff member asking questions, but the bulk of the content is coming from the participants. I suspect you'll see a lot more of that as we move forward, because there is an appetite for that kind of exchange without necessarily all of the trappings and diktats that you get in other places where you can have that kind of connection. But a lot of the stuff that Cami and Anlam were saying about community and about how those get built and that sense of place, and that may play a role in the funding mix as well, where you increasingly have property developers trying to add an arts or culture emphasis as part of their placemaking, and that potentially playing a role in how we get support for these kinds of programs. It may be that you end up with fewer full-time staff at some of these museums, and that their role is more of a convener or an organizer rather than somebody who plans, here's everything that's going to be shown. They put out a call for submissions and invite the community to do more of that kind of participation. But I don't think we're going to see the big national museums go away, even if the government funding does drop somewhat. Those collections have been there for several hundred years and are probably going to continue as far as we can see.
Great, thank you.
I actually,
Let me
can I
just,
just add?
let me just make an announcement to the audience that they should feel free to post any questions they have for any of the speakers or for all of them. Just post them in the comments section, please. And we're gonna have about 15 minutes at the end for answering these questions. Yeah, please, Anlam, go ahead.
So sorry, Yazan, for having interrupted you, but I just wanted to add to what Danielle was saying, because I think it's a crucial point about placemaking. And this became more evident to me on a personal level, but also on a sociological level with COVID-19. When we went into the first lockdown, as an expat living in London, I started questioning, without access to all the institutions that made me come to London, why would I live in London? Like, if I cannot go to the Tate, to the Barbican, what's the point in living in the city? So I think these institutions, whether big or small, really define our relationships to the city, but of course have also, beyond the emotional, personal connections, they also have real estate implications. And I think it is really hugely important to think about, the employment that they create, but also the effects they can have on citizen psychology. From a very basic standpoint, I think being able to share these social experiences at cultural institutions are a hugely important part of the city life, and otherwise the city is a ghost town. And also wanted to add that, for instance, in the art market, we have all been super resistant to technology because we thought that it demysticized the whole process. And we, as the guards of this industry, we needed to protect it. But actually, by making it more transparent, we make it stronger. And the same goes for museums, because by opening it up to new audiences, we make them more solid, because then their own communities will go to protect them. And I think having that personal connection with your audience is really important through this period, and being able to really touch those communities is really important, because then if you're in danger, they will come out to defend you, because they are a stakeholder of this institution, not just a visitor that came once. And I think that really starts at when you're really young, and that starts with educational programs. And I think we should really invest in, interpretation programs more and more.
Great, thank you so much. We have a few questions from the audience. People are anxious about the COVID situation and what's happening and when it might end. So we have a question on when do you think that art museums will recover and welcome international guests again? When will international guests be able to visit art museums in London? Any end in sight?
Well, I think that's a very straightforward question, slightly related to travel. I think as soon as the travel restrictions are kind of lifted, or maybe once we can feel there's a system in place, I think international visitors surely will kind of come see whether London institutions or elsewhere. But naturally, in the meantime, I think what we can do is just continue developing the digital content, which will, as we all mentioned here, never be a substitute. But as to Anlan's point, that the nurturing of relationships with the key stakeholders, whether these are the actual philanthropists or the audience or international visitors, should be an ongoing activity, whether in the form of a direct exhibition or digital content. So yeah, fingers crossed we can all travel soon, obviously.
By the summer,
There's
maybe?
a rumor that Heathrow might change their rules so that it's 5 days quarantine and then a test. And if that happens, then I think that's great. The news that we got yesterday that there is a vaccine that might be able to be put into production sooner rather than later is also great. But yeah, I think, Yazan, you're probably right. Probably not before the summer, I would imagine, just because of the time it takes to ramp stuff back up and to get the right show in there for the kind of audience that you have. Like, a lot of organizations have shifted their programming to match the audience that will be able to come to it, and getting the big blockbuster shows that tend to drive those international audiences back in. Those usually take about 3 years to put together, and they've all had to shift.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Another anxious question here. As someone who recently did an MA in art history, I'm finding it impossible to get a job in the art world. Do you think that by spring there will be more job openings in art galleries and museums? What does it look like? What are the job prospects for people in the art and culture industry?
Well, I would say it depends on which side of the art world you're looking for a job, because I think there will be jobs related to, digital transformation in the art world, digital content. But I would suspect that commercial galleries will be hiring less for sure. Auction houses will be hiring less, except for the digital fields. Art fairs will certainly not be hiring, and PR companies either. So I think maybe it's a good time to, invest in building new skills within the art world and look at where the industry is headed.
Yeah, I'd second Annem's point about transferable skills. Probably in the next 3 to 6 months, unlikely to see a lot more openings until you start seeing that activity picking back up. But even if it's getting a bookkeeping job, anything where you've got additional skills that'll set you apart from the other candidates, because it's always been tough to get into the art world, especially in London. Like, any job you go for is going to be competitive, and COVID hasn't made it easier. So the more breadth that you can demonstrate and the flexibility that you can demonstrate to say, hey, look, when I come on board, I'm going to be able to add value in multiple places, the stronger position you'll be in.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to add that, like, what I've experienced in my my own professional journey is that to think creatively about your own experience, because I've moved from the commercial to non-profit sector, but I've always felt that I've been relying on, I've been using a number of skills that helped me on both sides. So it's not just adding to your portfolio of experiences and degrees, whether more kind of technology-oriented elements, but equally thinking creatively about how you can apply the skills you've gathered in other sectors already.
So staying with COVID for a bit, we have a suggestion from the audience. What about streets as galleries? Having open air museums. What's wrong with that?
Well, there are initiatives in that, direction. Like just, an easy example that comes to mind is Friesa's Sculpture Park. And the fair had to be canceled due to COVID restrictions, but they kept on the Sculpture Park project, which drew a lot of, audiences to Regent's Park recently in October. And I'm sure my co-speakers can give more examples of that. And I think there should be more, art in public spaces that city dwellers can engage with. But obviously, it will also never replace the museum or gallery experience. It will be just another layer of possibilities that we offer the artists to, think about and, occupy the space in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I don't want to be the panelist talking about funding constantly, but I find with these types of initiatives, it's very difficult to make them work from the practical standpoint. So, Frieze Sculpture Park is a great example, but in the end, it is a commercially supported initiative. So, having seen how hard the galleries or art dealers have been hit with this pandemic, I think, we would need to think quite creatively how to support public art, which I think it's a great great space to be active in terms of putting it out there for the audience. And also in reference to Alan, I think it was your point about how important art's role is in the actual city geographical space and what impact it has on people's choices whether to live in one city or the other. So I think the public art definitely is a relevant factor here, but the question remains how to make it work.
Hold Still might be a good example of that. So the National Portrait Gallery did a project over the course of the summer, and those images have now got up on billboards across the country. And that's a nice example of where a commercial entity donated some space that wasn't going to be used otherwise because traffic levels are down, and was able to put up a collaborative project with a national that otherwise wouldn't have happened.
Exactly. And also Marina Abramovich's new opera will be also streamed, I think, in the Tottenham Court tube station. So it's another example of how something that was reserved for ticketed audiences will now become, a public performance.
We can think of whether there are any parallels with the fashion industry, with the recent kind of fashion weeks now becoming much more accessible than before through streaming.
We have another question from the audience. Do you think art institutions will have to take a political stance in matters such as Black Lives Matter? I guess this is related to so many different things, including the issues of funding, issues of accessibility, and so on. So what can art institutions do about these kind of political issues, or should they do something?
I would say absolutely. And it starts with, as Cami was saying, with their boards, with their top management. It starts with their HR strategy and vision, and then trickles down to their programming. So I think no art institution can be tone deaf in this climate, because arts institutions have a mission towards their community. And I think that it's wonderful that now there are, social media accounts who can denounce, certain issues with, certain museums and galleries, and can actually have an impact and can trigger change in our industry. And all these issues that we knew that existed in our arts institutions are now publicly debated, which is, I think, super healthy.
I would say it's something that's definitely been happening and has had a great impact, as Anlan mentioned. I wonder if we should ask, though, whether the effort that has been put will remain once the subject is no longer like the top headline in every newspaper. So I think it's something important to observe going forward.
I think there's a bit of positive spin on that actually as well, because both Arts Council England and ECMS have built in things around diversity and inclusion into their evaluation of everybody in their portfolios. So there is ongoing accountability there, at least for the next 3 or 4 years. We don't know what the funding situation is going to be like after that. Like, that's as far as the budgeting goes, but that is something that's coming up much more frequently in those evaluations, whereas before the evaluation would be much more just about the audience, it now does incorporate leadership and programming and general recruitment as well, to say we need to have this diversity across all strands of activity, not just who's walking through the door.
Thank you. We have about 3-4 minutes left and one more question to answer. What do you feel London offers in terms of arts and culture that is different from other large cities? And what do you see changing or staying the same about this going forward?
I guess, as we all know, the caliber and the quality of cultural initiatives and within the visual arts of types of exhibitions and events is really difficult to rival in London. However, going forward, as the second favorite subject of everyone after COVID, that is Brexit, will probably should make us think how big of a shift there might be from London to Paris, because we've seen quite a significant number of art dealers or galleries or collectors have actually relocated to France or just left London. So I've personally definitely seen a lot of stakeholders actually leaving London. So again, it's something that we should observe. Nevertheless, I remain hopeful. I still remember when I moved to London and going to galleries such as National Gallery or Tate was just an incredible experience in terms of the caliber of art you can be in direct contact with in London. I think that will never be challenged.
Yeah, I second Cami in the sense that London's biggest advantage was how international it is and was. And in continental Europe, there is no other city that is as diverse as London. However, I also fear that with Brexit, we will lose access to some international talent, and it might have an impact on, the cultural activity. But obviously, I don't see, it impacting institutions at large, but it might have an influence on, some spheres of the art market more prominently.
The same thing that's good for trading is good for the arts, in that you're right in between New York and the East, and it's easier for people to get to London from Africa than it is for them to go to New York or to go to the East. So where you actually see an interesting comparison is between London and Hong Kong, because they kind of act as anchors on opposite ends. But certainly within Europe, I don't think you have the same breadth of talent and the same diversity, as both Anlam and Cami were saying, anywhere else. Okay, this is very encouraging to hear.
Thank you all for such a wonderful panel and very thought-provoking answers. Danielle, Cami, Anlam, this was brilliant. And thanks to the audience for attending this and for all the great questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our panel on the arts and culture of the future, and thanks also to Siba and her team for organizing that. That was a very insightful deep dive into the arts and culture scene in London and some of the challenges we're going to face going forward. But also, I felt optimistic note in terms of where we're going forward and the opportunities that presents. Great. Well, thanks everyone for your participation so far. We're now going to go into a long break. Be back for 1 p.m. UK time. So we'll see you after that break to join us for A Place in the City, our panel that takes a look at, is a 360 overview of the future of the London real estate market. That's also a slightly longer panel going for 1.5 hours. So be sure to get something to eat, be watered and fed and ready to go at 1 p.m. for our next panel. So look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, everyone.
Everyone's talking about artificial intelligence, everyone's talking about AI, automation, robotics. This is the year for AI, so it's definitely interesting to see how this industry was also going through its ups and downs.
Stepping back and observing how AI and machine learning and all of those things as a nascent industry is transforming us is fascinating to me. We are people who are actually putting the information into the systems that are making the decisions that we then say it's AI. AI is not a thing. AI is us making things do things.
The future is not just within one industry alone or one tech medium alone. It's how we get to converge these things together. Looking at problems in your life, problems that you've seen around, issues around your companies, issues in the world, how can you use AI to help address this? Is to learn from the data that's taking place.
I think it's very exciting what's happening at the moment. We are at a point where AI is blowing up, it's getting much bigger. It's starting to be used across many industries.
To an extent, understand how important and significant nanotech is for the world and the coming future. But many people around the world don't realize that. And it's upon us in this room here to really educate the masses, to inform people, and to again keep building forward. So,
what is nanotechnology to you, and where do you see the trends going in the future?
I would say it is indeed almost everything. If you are able to control matter at that scale, you can, if you think about everything around us, is that.
Like, one of the advantages of our technology is that we are using paper machines and other really real processes to make the nanoparticles.
Using microscopes like ours to do non-destructive visualization and probing of the nano world.
So as the largest platform, we accelerate about 1,000 companies across 90 different countries every single year. And of course, we have 7 regional programs to make that happen. As I shared before, how you build a company in Africa is very different than how you build a company in the Americas and the Middle East and vice versa.
Basically, I try to find entrepreneurial champions to work with academic founders from top universities, basically help them create inventions from their laboratory, get transitioned out.
to make sure you build institutions of higher education in Africa so you won't have Africans risking their lives or 10 grads to come to your nation to go for a freedom path. I don't know, their own hope. I don't want my kids to grow up to fight HIV/AIDS. I want them to fight something else that they have not yet discovered. I don't want my kids to be fighting discrimination, prejudice. I want them to fight something else. We need to overcome these things now for the betterment of our new generations. And I believe we can. When I say Africa, you say can. Africa! 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 I cannot tell you. Africa! Thank you.
Very, very much excited to welcome all of you again to the Future Tech Week and of course the greater Globus Art ecosystem family. So welcome to all of you.
I'm hoping that today we're all going to get to learn different applications, different formats, different things when it comes to virtual reality. And for those who are not sort of familiar with that technology, can begin to just open your minds a bit more and recognize, wow, this thing can be applicable into my business, into my life, into my way of being in many ways.
With 5G, we're saying that we can do all of this computation somewhere else and then bring it to our device fully rendered, fully ready to go. All the device has to do is unpack it and shoot.
Actually really significantly grow the VR market. You know, if we can start getting more government funding for VR, that's going to really help everything.
5G is going to change the way we think about hardware. It's going to democratize a lot of these technologies. It's going to bring new capabilities of creating content that we haven't seen before.